So what are React hooks? React hooks help us work with our components in a more efficient way, you could say. In this course, you'll learn that you either have functional or class-based components in React, and that is the case. Now, in functional components, you got props and you return some JSX code. They are great for presentation, for presenting your content, but as you learned, you can't change internal state there. So therefore, each functional component typically is focused on one or only a few purposes, and it's simply there to output something, you could say. If you would want to react to a button, you would do that by getting a handler, a function pointer, as a prop, and then by executing that function through that prop so that the parent component, which at some point has to be a class-based component, is able to, for example, change some internal state upon that button press. Because class-based components, unlike functional components, do not just receive props, but in addition, they can also manage state. And state is that changeable thing which triggers a re-render when you change it. Therefore, your business logic typically lives in class-based components because typically when something changes, you want to re-render, and class-based components are the only components that can have something that changes and causes a re-render. Therefore, you typically also use class-based components to orchestrate your components, and overall, you have class-based and functional components work together. Now, we've all been at the point where we had a functional component and all of a sudden we needed to manage some state in there. For example, you have an input there and you want to store the input the user entered in your state and send it back into the input. This classic two-way binding thing. Now, in such a case, you would have to convert your functional component to a class-based one, but of course, this conversion is annoying. It's a lot of redundant work in the end. Now, in addition to managing state, class-based components also were the only components that could have lifecycle methods, also called lifecycle hooks, which are not to be confused with React hooks. Now, these lifecycle hooks or lifecycle methods also could be hard to use. It could be annoying to add component did mount, component did update, and ensure that you run the right logic at the right point of time, and maybe add the right if checks to avoid unnecessary re-renders or infinite loops. And for these reasons, for example, to get rid of the conversion, we have React hooks. Because React hooks essentially allow us to work with functional components only. Yes, that's right. When working with this new feature, you don't need to build any more class-based components. You still can, but you don't have to. You can now make everything work in functional components that previously required a class-based component. So you can write functional components everywhere, and hooks replace class-only functionalities. They replace state management and they replace lifecycle hooks, as you will learn in this module. Now, React hooks themselves are in the end just JavaScript functions, not components, functions, which can only be used inside of functional components or inside of other hooks, because as it turns out, and as you will learn in this module too, you can also write your own hooks. Now, how do you recognize React hooks? React hooks are JavaScript functions named like this, starting with a lowercase use and then your function name. Something like use state, and so on. You will see plenty of hooks throughout this module. Now, of course, that's just a rule the React team came up with. It's not a technical JavaScript thing. It's not a hard rule imposed on you by the language, by JavaScript. It's just a rule the React team came up with. Hooks are named like this. And modern React projects got built-in linting, which are automatic code checks that will basically recognize such functions and yell at you if you're using them incorrectly, or if you're using a hook in a place where you're not intended to use it, for example, in a normal non-hook JavaScript function. The idea behind React hooks is that you can expose certain possibly stateful functionalities to functional components, like managing state, but also like adding lifecycle methods. A bit different than with class-based components, but in the end you can make everything work that you could make work in class-based components. Hooks are highly reusable, and that's a core idea behind them. You can use one and the same hook in multiple functional components or other hooks, And each place that uses a hook uses it independent from the other places. So you're not using hooks to share data between components, but instead you can simply share functionality between components. And that's a difference. You can add certain logic to multiple components, but every component will then run that logic on its own. So to sum it up, hooks allow you to add state to functional components, also the lifecycle method thing to functional components, and you can share logic across components with hooks. And that logic can even be stateful. And all of that will, of course, make more sense the deeper we dive into hooks throughout this module. So that's just a rough first summary here. It's important to keep in mind that React hooks have nothing to do with lifecycle methods. You can actually replace lifecycle methods with hooks, but the name React hooks has nothing to do with lifecycle hooks. These are different hooks. React hooks, or just hooks, are called hooks because you hook a certain functionality into your functional components, or you hook into certain React functionalities, if you will. Lifecycle hooks are really just a synonym for lifecycle methods, and they are restricted to class-based components, so don't confuse these. It's also important to keep in mind or to understand that React hooks, this feature, was introduced with React 16.8. So if you're having a project that runs on an earlier version of React, you can't use React hooks. You can use everything else you learn in this course, but you can't use React hooks. You can't use what you learn in this module. They allow you to use functional components only, and you can use them for managing state or also for side effects, for example, for sending HTTP requests and then handling the response of these requests. You can also build custom hooks to share stateful or stateless logic across multiple components, and we'll also do this in this module. So this is now a first overview. Obviously, it's still entirely unclear what exactly React hooks are and how you use them. So therefore, let's dive into a dummy project and start using them. I think that makes it easiest to learn React hooks.